Alright, this might not work, but we're going to do this. So before I get into anything, I'm just going to skip straight to the end, because I have something to mention.
Okay.
And that is where Helmuth tells us, feel free to publish this. And that is a broad, sweeping statement, which means that I do not need further approval to share this conversation. Okay, back to the beginning. Alright, so someone that I met on Discord has introduced me to another person who has the default Discord logo and goes by the name Helmuth 1916. This is the beginning of our conversation, and your goal, dear viewer, assisted by AC and myself, is to determine if you believe this person is genuine or if some sort of shenanigans are going on.
Shenanigans! Shenanigans! Shenanigans!
So, Friedzel says, he's not on right now, but I'll try to get him on. I say, neat. Hello, Helmuth.
All rise in the presence of Dark Helmuth.
It's nice to see a man from the war still around. We are losing this generation. At this point, all I know is that Friedzel knows of a World War II veteran. Helmuth says, indeed we are. Too quick. So a bit sentimental there, which is to be expected of someone if his name is to be accounted, somewhere in the area of 102 years old. Plenty of time to change that default Discord icon to something else. But let's get into the meat of our conversation so you can see what we're talking about here. I mentioned I'd like to interview you one of these days. Can you get a mic? And he says, notice how he's not capitalizing his I here. And when he hangs off the end of a sentence, which is going to happen fairly often, instead of 3 periods, which is known as, I think it's called an ellipse, not quite sure, an ellipsis? Yes, an ellipsis. He uses 2 periods, which is nothing at all. In other words, this is not the best grammar.
Bob's or Vagon, whichever will it be.
Keep
to
in
be
mind,
honest, from people that text me,
Yeah.
specifically my parents and other people who aren't phone literate, they tend to do this a lot. I don't
Yeah.
know what it is with
Yeah.
the keyboard, but
okay.
he's at least
And
not someone who grew up on technology.
It is possible that this is, I'm just pointing these things out, not saying what they might imply at this point. He says, I could try to acquire one, but I do not know much about computers, so my apologies if there's also no comma there. So my apologies if my messages come slow. And that's also bad grammar as well. Slowly would be more appropriate. And I wouldn't normally make a deal about that, but, well, I'll get into that'll bear more on what is coming. But keep in mind, this is represented as a 102-year-old man. So far, that's all we know about him. I say that's fine. I'm only 32, and I already feel out of touch. It's called empathy. He says we could otherwise talk by text. I find this much simpler. Friedzel volunteers with, well, Helmuth, can you tell Toshio what you did during the war and so on?
About your pamphlet, I'm not seeing anything about German history between 1939 and 1945. There's just a big gap. Everyone was on vacation!
Maybe some things before and after the war. And I clarify with, I'd like to hear about growing up as a kid. Where were you born? What things were like? Notice this is a very open-ended question that is intended to take somebody back.
What we do here is go back.
And one of the things that I do is I interview people. I often open with the question, you were born and then things happened. Tell me about that. And every single time I've asked that question, someone has started with very early memories that they had as a kid. I could be wrong, but generally people talk about a really early memory or something from their childhood, something personal, because, you know, that's a pretty typical interview question. You've seen some amazing advances in the world, I say, just really encouraging him to open up here. And I mentioned that my grandpa used to tell me stories about logging with an axe and a saw. A single steam engine was used for everything from hauling logs to milling and cooking food. So I'm interested in getting slice of life information here, which, if you grew up in the early 1900s, I'm sure you've seen so many things that just have completely changed over the years. How nice it would feel to go back into that nostalgic setting. And the answer I got is something that I didn't think too much on at the time, but it's not the answer you would expect. Well, I'm not gonna say that. Sorry, that's saying too much. That's a leading statement. Let's just get into his answer. Helmuth replies, I was born in quite a rich family in 1916 during the First World War. My father was an officer and my mother was a baker. Interesting. Though when the war ended, we had to move since the French occupied... French is not capital. I won't point out more of the... There's a lot of grammatical liberties here. They're not standard English. And easy on the grammar, if you will. Since the French occupied and burnt down some houses, including ours in 1919, because people did not work for them in the occupied factories.
Well, obviously we have a
Arsonist.
in
Austria.
he's climbing in your windows, he's snatching your people up.
So 1916, he said that he grew up in a quite rich family. Not quite rich enough, I suppose, to follow the tradition of having the man be the one that works outside the home and the mother not have a job outside the home once she starts raising children. Oh well, I didn't really think on that too much. It is what it is. But no specifics here. I remember specifically this or that thing happening. No stories here, just sort of facts. Things that could apply to any number of people. Nothing really truly of a personal flavor here.
Oh,
So yeah, about this guy.
I think the newborn's gonna need a bottle. Tell me, Butler.
In my opinion, I believe that maybe this guy isn't who he says he is.
I suspect the same things, and AC and I are going through looking at why that may be the case. And I'm sort of making it an open-ended thing. I'm actually recording right now, and I'm mentioning what he's saying, and then bringing up a little bit of my response to that, just in light of the general feel of things. And anyway, can you see the screen share that's going on right now?
I sure can.
Awesome. Okay, let's keep going then. So we're joined by Butler, who will also maybe remain as silent as AC is, as I just read through these things. But we'll come to our conclusions at the end.
I'm trying to find something right now, honestly. He mentions that...
I heard you searching something.
Yeah, the French occupied. I'm just... Like, I don't doubt that. I'm looking to see if there's any, like, record of French occupying specifically Austro-Hungary. Because he also is unsure of the name.
Which is a bit strange if you...
1916, he would have been, what? He would have been, 3 by the time the war ended.
And you could say that he's unsure of what I would know the country as.
Yeah.
No, the French never occupied Austria.
I thought Austria had a revolution.
Hungary.
No, they didn't have a revolution. They were kind of forced apart, like the Ottoman Empire was forced
He
apart.
definitely said when the war ended, we had to move since the French occupied and burnt down some houses in 1919.
Yeah, that's
Because
something that
people
the
didn't work for them
Germans,
in the occupied factories. So he's saying that the French occupied their factories, forced people to work in those factories, and burned down houses when people did not work in those factories. And of course, immediately my first thought is propaganda. Far too late for propaganda to be effective. But I'm not going to remind, someone who was born in 1916 what year it is.
Are you from around here?
I was, but I'd been in Jumanji.
I'm just going to let them talk. And if they're not someone that was born in 1916, I think it will become apparent over the course of the conversation. So let's keep moving, because we got more ground to cover, and then we'll start looking back at these things and what they perhaps entail about our man Helmuth.
I can't breathe in this thing!
And I say, with a name like Helmuth, do you live in a Germanic country? Any details you can recall would be welcome. The memories of your generation are tragically passing away. And that is absolutely true. The entire generation that lived and fought throughout World War II is dying off day by day, along with their first-hand accounts. And what I'm really looking for here is first-hand accounts. And so far I haven't heard any stories, just facts. But let's keep going. Helmut says, I was born in Austria. No period. I'll stop with the grammar stuff. This is poor grammar. I was born in Austria. This is like, I'm not saying this is African Prince bad grammar, but it's getting close. I was born in Austria back then. They were a major power, such as the Prussians and the French. I believe Austro-Hungary. I believe I'm not quite as hungry. I just had lunch. Yes, I say. I've heard of their exploits in the First World War. Helmut saying, my father had plans to move us to Germany in 1918, but when the Germans and Austrians were collapsed, we were not allowed to work or live in peace without observation. Ooh.
I knew it. I'm surrounded by assholes.
Ooh. I say, the interwar period was very hard on Germanic peoples. What was school like for you? Did you have a tutor? Again, because he was supposedly from a rich family. An Austrian would not be considered strange for having a private tutor, someone you would remember and tell stories about. Oh yes, I remember Sven, he smelled of the finest aged fish, or whatever. I'm trying to find stories here, people that he remembers, because that's what I'm about. People are the most valuable thing on the planet, and I love to hear their stories. I need to do some cleaning, I say, before the baby wakes up. Please feel free to share your memories while I'm away from the keyboard. And indeed, I went and washed some baby bottles. And I get this block of text. There were 4 soldiers stationed in every classroom for the older gents, but when I was smaller, there were only patrols outside of the schools. So someone apparently had soldiers in the school buildings. Helmut attending, I suppose, public school. But later, up until the late 20s, the British and French soldiers would keep eyes on everybody.
I have to make notes as we're listening.
Okay. So active observation by the British and the French. But, interesting. There are places where he doesn't put a period at the end of a sentence, but he decides to switch out here and go for, instead of a comma, using a period. And then, anyway. But education was about the same as it is today. Incomplete ellipsis. Apparently, he was educated with... no snarky comment. Save that for later. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler, not worthy of having his name capitalized, became a president of Germany, I moved to Germany and signed up for the SA, which is worthy of being capitalized, because it seemed good at the time. Apparently, the SA is... they were They were definitely
It was the
Hitler's.
precursor to the SS.
They were
basically.
Hitler's goons for sure. Very much Nazis. They caused a lot of trouble and pawned it off as other people causing trouble, giving Hitler the excuse to jump in and cause more trouble. Only for me to be relocated one day and all my buds were killed.
Baby, I am not afraid to die. Push me to the edge. All my friends are dead.
Okay, he says he was relocated and all of his friends were killed when they smashed all the windows for the Jewish stores and shot a whole lot of SA officers. So this appears to be given as the same event. Kristallnacht is unmistakable here. Smashed all the windows for the Jewish stores. That's Kristallnacht. Shooting a lot of SA. It's hard to track down.
It's referring usually what's commonly called as the Night of the Long Knives, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Butler, but it was it Goering who encouraged Hitler, or who was it?
You guys discuss. I'll be back in a minute.
Was it? I swear it started with a G. Maybe not.
Goebbels? Was it Goebbels?
Yeah, was it Goebbels?
I thought so. But yeah, that's the thing. There's like a 4-year gap. And the Night of the Long Knives came first in 1934. Kristallnacht didn't happen until 1938. And even then, both of those were largely... I mean, if this guy's Austrian, then how... what business is it of his what some German party at the time was doing? Because at the time, Germany, hadn't occupied Austria yet.
Yeah. It seems, as I'm reading this, both Himmler and Goering welcomed Hitler's decision, falling for the independence of the SS and the removal of the SA.
Mm-hmm.
Of
course, Himmler's going to support that.
Well, yeah. I've read on, flipping back a bit if we do, for the occupation, it's clear that there were... I'm having trouble finding any, and this is with very limited research, 10 minutes, of any technical wars of British and French fighting directly in Austria-Hungary.
I can't find anything like that either.
Yeah, there's
occupation.
nothing in terms of a... Yeah, it never... It's more like... I haven't found anything where British and French soldiers were specifically fighting Austro-Hungarian soldiers, or Austrian-Hungarian soldiers, because there wasn't a common front.
Pizza! Pizza time.
Austria-Hungary was on the other side of Italy. Italy was fighting them, and that's quite clear. But in terms of a developed front, it doesn't seem like...
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm back. You've been discussing history stuff?
Yes.
All right.
Disgusting it.
I've been prejudging Helmut in my mind the whole time. I'm thoroughly convinced that he's a fraud, and I'm gonna go ahead and reveal that now because, well, it's gonna taint the rest of my. You can tell I haven't been completely unbiased in my presentation of him. But let's move on. So you guys wrap up what you were saying, and we'll read some more of what he's been talking about.
We were actually talking about we talked about Kristallnacht and the Night of the Long Knives and how they were they're 4 years apart, and it seems weird that Butler pointed out, it seems weird that an Austrian cares about what's happening in Germany at the time, since they're not a common nation. They only speak a semi-common language.
Of course he cares. All of his buds were killed. All of them. Even the ones that later converse with him about betraying their childhood friendship. But we'll talk more about that. Oh, joining the SA. Okay. Adolf Hitler, they all thought he was great, but, maybe not so much, this is cut and dried, we'll call it immediate post-war Nazi propaganda. We'll call it Nazi propaganda. This is cut and dried Nazi propaganda, or the kind of reasoning you hear from people who are still active as part of the Nazi party. this is how they would explain the war. There are ex-Nazis who talk about these things, but they have a different way of referring to them. A lot of people don't just blame Hitler for the actions of an entire nation, which I think is reasonable. But let's move on. So Hitler, he was all about that. Cheerful screams, waving. In 38, he says, I was sent into the... So he's really skipping along here. And again, there's no personal stories of something you would see in a movie scene, you know, where you've got, this is me, this is my buddy Sven, smelling a fish, we enter into the scene, and our first reaction upon walking into boot camp was a look of disgust from our commanding officer, wrinkling his nose and commenting upon the aroma of the two of us. But we were soon to become friends. You know, I can write better than this, but maybe he just wants to get to something else. So maybe he's going to open up and start telling a story instead of, you know, his half a sheet of scribbled Google search results. Mixed with with propaganda. Let's see if this evolves into something more real. And you know, this could be a real 102-year-old man. I've been surprised before. So stationed on the Czechoslovak border, this is where it gets kind of interesting because we'll see. I met people who were my childhood friends. Okay, these must not be the ones that were shot after Kristallnacht by parties unidentified. They're friends here. His buds were all killed, but friends were still remaining. He says they hated me, as he's here stationed on the Czechoslovak border, I'm assuming, because I had signed up for the Nazis instead of helping them.
Oh, my dude, you just got pranked!
So his friends...
Well, and if I can...
Yes.
If I can point something out, he says childhood friends, but the part of Czechoslovakia that was occupied, I'm pretty sure only shared a border with Germany, not Austria. Those friends would go on to become Slovakia.
This Austrian man is already out of place in the SA, but now he's meeting, presumably on the Czechoslovak border, unless, you know, I thought, you know, old fella, he could have his wires crossed and just be jumping around through time. And, you know, I felt like he might be getting to something, so I just let him talk. Also, you know, I was changing diapers and stuff. And I try not to overthink these things when I'm actually talking to somebody, because I just want to listen to what they're saying instead of, you know, doing this mockery that I'm doing right now. But this Austrian man is stationed on the Czechoslovak border, and he's meeting there, presumably, friends from his childhood who are upset with him for joining the German political arm of the Nazi Party, which doesn't generally refer to itself as the Nazi Party. They like to call themselves National Socialists. But he refers to the party as the Nazi Party. He says that these friends had umbrage with him because he had joined the Nazis instead of helping them. So these friends would be, they would consider the Nazis as enemies this early in the game. And so he goes on here, and when we occupied the Czechoslovaks, we were sent to the Polish border corridor for regular patrols. I did not do much. Yes.
Czechoslovaks?
Czechoslovakians, he says, yeah, and when we occupied the Czechoslovakians, we were sent to the Polish border.
Well, because the reason I bring that up is because at the time, they made a pretty big distinction, especially the Germans, the difference between Slovaks and the Czech.
And that has to do with their racist worldview, where Slavs were considered subhuman, and the Czechs were eligible for a consideration as der Übermensch. Yeah. So this man who was born in an era dominated by defining people as different races of humanity with differing levels of value, has ceased to use that terminology entirely in his communication. What a progressive man. And then we occupy the Czechoslovaks. And the first thing he says here is, back in Czechoslovakia, he killed time in the whorehouses, is what he was saying. Spent some nice nights in the girl houses. And we knew we could not hold a war for long. Now, I don't get this. Hold a war, I guess hold off a war is what I'm thinking, because there's just no way that someone would look at the forces of Poland compared with the forces of the United German Front, spit roasting Poland between the USSR.
Poland. Is this Germany? Is this Russia?
So you've got,
like, I'll admit, like, against France was considered a major power at the time, but Poland, nobody thought highly of. Let's face it.
No one thought highly of Poland, which is why when everybody backed away from supporting Poland, they were like, fuck you guys, this is betrayal. Because they knew they wouldn't stand. I believe the phrase treachery most foul, but the fuck you was definitely implied. So he goes on to talk about invading Poland, and it looks like he did do the Google search to see how Germany actually justified the invasion. They set up some fake border post attacks, and you can look that up on Wikipedia yourself. You will not get the same version you hear here, for obvious reasons, because it was clearly a ruse set up by Hitler to be justification for a war that he had already announced he would be participating in. And then suddenly Poland attacks. Of course they did. Anyway, he says, it was quite nice, and then he says it was rather quick, but they fought harder than most I saw. Okay, let's move on. I'm not going to touch that. We gotta move on. The war holds a large place in your memory, I say. How old were you then? Again, I'm looking for him to step back into history. He says, I was 23 when the war started. Not going to do the math. He probably did, so I'm not going to check it. I say that's about the age I met my wife, right? When did you know this is... He could talk about the romance here, but I guess with his hand sitting right next to him, it's probably not appropriate to bring up lovers. Helmuth says, I did not think of women during the early war. Okay, hold on. So he was banging chicks in the whorehouses, but he says, I didn't think of women during the early war because I wanted a child that I could stay home with and take care of. He wanted his own tank baby. What? He wanted to be a stay-at-home dad. I guess because his mom was a baker and never stayed at home the way that a Hausfrau would be expected to, he wanted to be a stay-at-home mother for his children. So he says he didn't think about women while he was banging them in the whorehouses during the early war. And I say, was there a time when you began to think less about the future? Am I a good interviewer? Like, these are all great chances to jump into some real storytelling.
You really...
And this is what he gives me. He says, I thought about the future a lot during my time in the war, but when the Bolsheviks surrounded Berlin, I thought about that day and that second. I says, that must have been a terrifying experience. And this is his answer. It was scary, yes. And that's it. I mean, come on. Fly Daily is better at telling stories than this. So I tell him, you have a talent for understatement. Many of your generation did not survive the war. What happened for you after Berlin? He says, I was trialed after the war with many others. I was sent to prison for doing alleged war crimes in Russia. Wow, okay, he got around. Would you look at the time? He says, I'm going to go lay down now. I wish to write you tomorrow, Mr. Toshio. Get some rest, sir. Thanks for sharing with me. I'll see you tomorrow. Missed a day there. I say Sunday was busy for me. How you feeling today, sir? He says, it has been quite interesting. I've been talking to some of my old buddies from the war. So he has some friends around still. It's a small club. I say, tell me more. Sorry if I'm late replying. 2 small women require my attention constantly. And as you can hear from the background, that is still the case at this time. Bubba! Bubba! You're playing. Are you gonna eat? No, you're just getting it all over your face. Okay. He says, well, most people out of my regiment are not with us anymore. I'm glad he knows what regiment he was in, because AC, Butler, you guys were not able to find that, were you?
Nope.
Well, we looked it up, and his division only consisted of...
Yo, he dead.
Yep. Okay. Well, he researched so hard that his connection died. Anyway.
So the 39th Division, the only one we could find, let me pull it up again while I'm talking, only served from 42 onwards, and it was made up of Polish soldiers, usually fighting on the Eastern
Polish?
Front.
Easy.
Yeah.
Something stinketh. I think it may not be only Sven. Let's move on here. The ones that are still around, he says, very good friends of mine. I say there's a friend that's closer than a brother. Nothing like the brotherhood a soldier has with his comrades. And that's true. How are your friends doing? He says, most of them are in bad condition, but I used to run marathons when I was young, so in hopeful reason, that gave me an extra boost, I suppose. Interesting choice of words. Almost Indian scammer choice of words. Let's move on. I say this reminds me of Louis Zamperini. Have you heard of the man? He ran in the Berlin Olympics before flying in the Pacific against the Japanese. He survived the war in a Japanese prison camp. If you'd like to mention it, I'm interested in what happened after the war. You mentioned prison, and I presume you're not still there. Haha! Best joke ever. It says, I'm not there anymore, no. I was handed over to the Soviets, and I spent time in prison. I haven't looked up how long I spent in prison. Let me look real quick. I say, you're lucky to be alive, and he says, the lucky ones came out in coffins in Russia. It was horrible. We got 1 meal a day. Soup and water. Soup and water. Okay. Was this a labor camp? He says, yep, we made ammunition, mined coal, and repaired vehicles. That last one seems like he might have been working for Gaijin. They probably had him fixing flight models, which explains the workmanship. He says, sometimes we were allowed to work in farms and yards where we stole food to eat. Those who did not work were hanged or fed to dogs. The last one is a bit shocking. I mean, not to make light of the situation in the gulags at all. It was just as bad as the worst conditions during World War II, long after the war. You can read actual, real first-person accounts of the horrible things that happened there. And that is not a joking matter.
The book for that would be recommended is Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzheim, I believe is the name.
Yes, definitely read that book by Alexander Solzheim. And also read the Louis Zamperini biography. Do not watch the movie. It is a steaming pile of Hollywood trash that misses the point entirely and leaves out all of the nasty, real details. Read the book. It's quite good. Anyway, Helmuth goes on, to this day I cannot stand looking a Soviet veteran in the eye without some regret that I did not pull my trigger in those situations. So I guess he had a gun in the camp. I don't know. Ever since the war ended and we were bashed for our views and atrocities, those war criminals in the East kept doing their dirty work. And I say, I've read of things like this, referring to the situations in the gulags. He says, I can speak to a man who served with them. I can shake his hand, but I will never respect them for what they did to me and the guys in my regiment. I say those memories are a heavy burden. Referring back to Zamperini, he wrote of dreaming every night that he was killing a certain prison guard from his days of torture. Look, see how I'm a better storyteller than Helmut is? And I say, have you found peace with the past? Sorry if this is too personal of a question. We can talk of more pleasant things if you like. And he says, I will never find peace. Yeah, that's right. The whining of a child. Drink. Yeah. Take the baba. Take the baba. Yeah. There we go. Nope. Okay. She needs to be held. Hi, baby.
That's fine. I can throw in that I got the last name wrong. It's Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who did. It's an amazing book. I've got the audiobook right now, and this is a little off topic from what's currently going on, but I don't know. It talks. I'm pretty sure he basically gives the most factual and contextually accurate history of laws in Russia under the Communist Party from, the October Revolution till Stalin's death, almost.
I'll have to check that out. Listen to how fine this baby is now that she's being held. Yeah, you just want a daddy. Yeah, okay. Helmut says, I will never find peace. Oh, I got a new message. Helmut says, I will never find peace with the past. Some things you cannot unsee. I ask him, what keeps you going? And he says, I want to tell people what truly happened during the war. Which is interesting, because he hasn't really told us much about what happened. Just sort of statements without any story behind them. You know what I mean? A great example that I can think of immediately is what I mentioned, Louis Zamperini. And in his story, he very clearly, he doesn't just say, that the Japanese were horrible to him. He talks about specific things that they did. And these were things that were burned into his mind. And as someone who has experienced things that have been burned into my mind, it feels really good to talk about those and to work those things out, like specific things. And we haven't gotten anything along those lines from our guy Helmut. So let's keep going. You're starting to see a pattern here, probably, if you're rooting what I'm tooting here. Some talk about war crimes and how, that was pretty bad, but, the other stuff was worse. Just men who followed orders. Okay, that's starting to sound really cliche. And I say, you lived through dark times. You saw the ugliest parts of human nature, and your eyes will never forget. I'm not an old man, but I think the most tragic thing is for a man to die without finding peace. And then I asked him if God has ever reached out to him. And it's in times like this where people tend to either have a spiritual awakening or decide that God doesn't exist. And Helmut says, I stopped believing in God in 1944. And then that's pretty much the end of our conversation. He ends with another edgelord statement here, which is also does not have internal integrity, and by that I mean it's patently bullshit. So he says, when you have to face an enemy, a common enemy, and for now he uses a period and a capitalization. You know what? Again, let's move on. Not enough about the grammar.
Speaking of illiterate, I'm here to spread awareness for illiterate people.
And your comrades rather choose to take their lives than to face them. You know you're facing a monster. That's not the only explanation for that situation. If you're facing a military defeat and your friends decide to kill themselves, it could be because your friends are cowards, or because they're hopeless. So that's it. Judging from what we've seen and what we've talked about along these lines, AC, what do you think? Real or hoax?
I'm hard pressed to call anybody a hoax without like some certifiable evidence. It seems fishy. Most military people don't forget their unit numbers wrong, especially where and when they served. We from at least the research that Butler and I did, probably an hour and a half, 2 hours, we couldn't find anything concerning the 39th. We looked up, maybe there was a division that was renamed or it was reformed under certain circumstances, that they were compressed, because that's very common.
Mm-hmm.
But anything in 1938 at least, there was nothing. I don't know why the Germans didn't have a 39th division, but they didn't. Or
just
at least
just to prove Helmuth wrong. So I get the idea on that one, and I got to wrap things up pretty quick because Mama just came home. So a second question, I'm going to put you down as a maybe, and a second question: is there anything that Helmuth said here that you wouldn't be able to find with a Google search or to make up?
Is there anything?
In other words,
fact check? Like
anything? No, let's put it this way: is there anything that proves this is a first-hand account?
So more of an anecdotal versus something he experienced. What you're saying? Besides, like I would say an insignificant thing that he said about there being soldiers in the classrooms and patrolling. There's no way I could find any information on that. That seems very specific. And that'd be about it. Everything else that he's mentioned, like you pointed out, has been very generic isn't the right word, but very historically sounding. It's presented like a documentary more so than someone retelling what they did.
Yeah, you could say it's common knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, like, he can just say 1933 and then he, 38 and 39 and reference some events. But it's from the stuff that he's given us that we could look up. There's not. I'm hard pressed, like I said.
Okay, Butler, what do you think? Legit 102-year-old Nazi or hoax?
Butler's connection isn't strong, is what he said.
I'm gonna put him down for hoax.
put him down for a hoax.
So that's what we got. I told our man Helmuth that I would make a video out of this. I told him I'd begin the work of making a video, as you can see, and that he would be the first one to see it. It will be my pleasure to show him this video where I tell him that he's a scammer and to go matrically ejaculate. Have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.